We're here at beautiful Point Ellice House in Victoria to introduce our books. But first, my name is Edeana Malcom.
And I'm Vanessa Winn.
And I'd like to tell you how we met. I've been doing Tai Chi for about 10 years, and last year Vanessa joined our group. And in December, when we were having a luncheon, I was sitting next to her, and we started talking, and we discovered that we were both writers. We both write historical fiction, and we had both just finished writing books that were set in 19th century Victoria. In fact, they were set right here at Point Ellice House. So we decided to have a joint book launch at Point Ellice House. And then the COVID-19 struck, and so we are now having a reading and a virtual book launch here.
So we thought it was quite a coincidence that not only were we writers, but that we both had written a book about Point Ellice, and also that the timing of it takes many years to write a book, and that we had both happened to have finished at about the same time, and we were both planning on launching late this spring or summer. And of course, as Edeana mentioned, it didn't go quite according to plan because of the pandemic. But here we still are at Point Ellice, and I'm sure it will last another century. That was totally ad-lib.
Very good. It was.
My novel Trappings is set here at Point Ellice in its very early years, and it's about its first owners. Kate Work, when she was married, was given this property by her father, Chief Actor John Work of the Hudson Bay Company. At the time, he was the largest landowner in Victoria, but being the 19th century, he sold it for a token amount to Kate's husband, Charles. And so legally, on paper, it was in Charles' name and not Kate's. She married Charles when she was quite young. She was only 18. She wasn't quite sure why the Wallaces left Nova Scotia, since they seemed to be very well connected there, which they remind her of quite often. They made a lot of their middle name Wentworth and passed it on from father to son. So the father was also named Charles Wentworth Wallace. The name Wentworth was bestowed on him by Sir John Wentworth of Nova Scotia, at the time Lieutenant Governor. And Kate perhaps doesn't feel she's in a strong position to be asking too many questions about the Wallaces, because she has some of her own about her own family in the fur trade. Her mother, Mrs. Work, has Indigenous heritage, and Kate's mother-in-law, Mrs. Wallace, tends to look down on the family because of this. And also there's some uncertainty about who was Mrs. Work's father. To make things more challenging for Kate, her mother-in-law lives across the street at Point Ellice, so she sees her very frequently. But initially things go really well for the young couple. Wallace is a successful merchant until BC's gold rushes start to fizzle and BC hits its first recession. And then a string of disasters falls on the young couple, and this becomes rather oddly intertwined with the political struggles in Victoria as it becomes, or as it is fighting to be the capital of the new colony of Vancouver Island, merged with British Columbia. So Trappings begins in 1866. Kate and Charles have sadly just lost their firstborn daughter, Abby, a few months earlier. And Kate is coming out of deep mourning into second or half mourning. Thanks to Queen Victoria, these social customs around grieving were quite rigid, And they could also be really isolating, especially for someone young. But on the brighter side, Kate has a very supportive family, and they have plans to get her back into society and also out of the reach of Kate's mother-in-law, Mrs. Wallace, across the street. And that's where Trappings begins. Mrs. Wallace peered at the small creation in Kate's hands. "What have you there?" "I am making a brooch of Abby's hair." "Oh, but it is hasty yet to think of wearing any jewelry other than jet." "6 months," said Kate, tracing her forefinger over the braids, so near her own warm shade of brunette. "Long enough." "You forget my departed husband." The widow stood before the blinded window in severe silhouette, the bombazine of her dress swallowing up much of the remaining light. "Followed to the grave by little Abby. God keep her, my only namesake. Together they are worthy of more notice than a mere 6 months." Unable to focus on the dark void of the widow's attire, Kate averted her gaze. The clock ticked heavily on the mantel as if it were keeping score for the dead. Compared with Abby, the late Dr. Charles Wentworth Wallace was nothing to Kate. She had worn black for 3 months after his death the previous year. More respect than he was due, probably. More respect than the Wallaces had shown her own father when he died, certainly. She would not have Abby's sacred memory saddled to the late doctor, or the widow's mourning shadow her own, for which the darkest jet was inadequate. "I wish to take a remembrance of Abby on the excursion with me, and wherever I go." Kate glanced from the woven hair in her palm down to her daughter, who'd been putting her doll Abby to bed in the subdued light, tucking her in over and over. "My family believes I ought to assume half mourning, as much for Eliza's sake as my own." "On the excursion? My dear Catherine, your family is well-meaning, no doubt, but perhaps far removed from the established haunts of civilized men as those I knew in Halifax. Perhaps they cannot entirely appreciate what my husband is owed." Keeping her eye on Eliza, Kate refused to acknowledge the slight on her family's long tenure in the West. It was a common joke among those envious of the fur traders that HBC stood for Here Before Christ. Through marriage to her, the Wallaces had enjoyed plenty of the Hudson Bay Company's deep-rooted advantages. Even in the depressed, muddy wake of the receding gold rush, the chief factors, immune to boom or bust, could offer respite by hosting a pleasure cruise. Stroking the braid cupped in her hand, Kate felt a stir of uneasiness that the Wallaces' dignity might thwart her attendance. Yet she had her own doubts whether she was ready to emerge from the dark cocoon of mourning Abby. Her 24 years had provided her with so many reasons to grieve close to home. "I may have a suitable jet brooch." Mrs. Wallace held out her hand as if offering a favor. "Give me the lock, and I will see if it fits." Kate drew back the braid, holding it tight. She would not part with this last memento of Abby. Even if her mother-in-law had jewelry left to spare, she doubted she would receive any. Drawing up the semicircle drive, the sound of a buggy relieved the burden of a reply from Kate. She turned her head to listen. Eliza jumped up and ran out to the front room to look, calling "Horsey" repeatedly in a crescendo of glee. "That child," said Mrs. Wallace, shaking her head, "running wild." "Auntie," cried Eliza, banging on the window, then rushing to the front door. Kate heard her sister's voice. Moments later, Eliza was pulling her into the room. "Jane," said Kate with a welcoming smile. She rose to embrace her eldest sister, who kissed her with Eliza giggling engulfed between their skirts. Stepping back, her sister nodded politely to the other visitor. Jane had their father's deep-set eyes and their mother's expression of implacable calm, with which she steadily regarded the widow. Mrs. Wallace. Mrs. Tommy, I was just taking my leave. Well, will we see you Thursday then? I understand you were undecided about coming on the picnic party down Puget Sound. My husband is confirming all the arrangements. Undecided, said the widow sharply, glancing at Kate. It did not seem you wished to come, said Kate. She revealed the woven braid in her hand, though there was no need to declare her intent to her sister. Jane had alarmed the outing to remove her, at least temporarily, from the scene of her sorrow. From her reticule, Jane took out a brooch and quietly pressed it into Kate's pale hand. Jewelry had become, at Point Ellice, an expense too difficult to justify. It was not jet, but gold, gleaming softly in her palm, precisely what her husband had found so little of in the Caribou. Indeed, I had better come. Mrs. Wallace gave the wide, close-lipped smile that reminded Kate of a mason jar lid being tightened, curved but contained and possibly drip-proof. Catherine will be in want of assistance.